I do think the more that we understand things like long-term reliability, intergenerational equity, social outcomes, including things like health, education, and those sorts of things, the better we understand those and the better we can analyze people and our environments and our cities, the better we will be at making decisions about them.
Are you interested in distributed well-being? What do you think about density as a measurement for affordability? How can we use the why, how, what questions for better urban futures? Stay tuned for answers from Dr. Haydn Read.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Dr. Haydn Read, a specialist practitioner in system thinking and action. We will talk about his vision for the future of cities, community well-being, evidence-based decision-making, organic versus planned city growth, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Dr. Haydn Read found a way to live his best life as Te Hēteri for the Te Whānau-ā-Apanui. He supports his EV friends to understand the challenges ahead as a specialist practitioner in system thinking and action, and a way forward to tackle them. As a pracademic, Dr. Read also finds privilege in working with government, supporting initiatives to improve the well-being of communities across Aotearoa New Zealand more generally. He has been a senior executive in private and public sectors for nearly 30 years in Aotearoa New Zealand and internationally. His passion lies in unpacking complex problems and helping others find solutions to the most difficult and intractable ones, some refer to as wicked, especially those impacting on the most vulnerable in our communities. He has a skill in big data, digital twins, and smart cities to support big data analytics and evidence-based decision-making to support those endeavours, something he sees as an imperative for any infrastructuralist. His vision is simple. Every person in Aotearoa, New Zealand, should be afforded the same opportunities as the next, something we need to rediscover as a nation of people who could be first amongst all equals to achieve this aspiration. But mostly, he will tell you he is a lifestyle farmer from Waimana in the Eastern Bay of Plenty. And with that, Haydn, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast. Let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
I think folk might best describe cities and how I feel about cities is we're great places for people to live, work and play in. And that kind of sounds simple, right? But cities are actually really complex, if I can use a biological analogy. They're complex organisms. They are full of diversity, not just in terms of people, but in terms of an infrastructure sort of lens. There's lots of bits to the puzzle, if I could put it that way. And I suspect what's really fascinating for us thinking about our cities in the future is how do you plug all that in some sort of systematized, harmonized, standardized way that allows people and people who look after infrastructure maneuver in and around it and still keep the lights on and the wheels turning and all of those sorts of things. And I do think part of the challenge for folk who are looking after cities these days is how do you not prescribe what you can do in the future with what you do today? How do you maintain the flexibility? And a good example is just laying a large road. It's going to be there for 100 years, which means something else can't be there for the next 100 years. So you have to have a real strong sense of the temporal element or time and try and figure out what the world looks like in another, say, 100 years. So when you make some of these large capital investment decisions, you have a lens or a sense of what that looks like. And of course, all of our crystal balls are broken. We just try to figure out the things that help us make those decisions. And I could talk about analytics, and I will at some stage, and the role of data, and more recently things like smart cities and those sorts of tools, which are in so many ways still nascent. But future cities is being able to encapsulate all of those kind of worldviews. I guess the final thing might be, if you know that, then you start delving into some things like systems views of pretty smarty pants people have written, Vanguard and others, about what that looks like. So you can start to pack some of that complexity, might be the word, such that you can figure out a way to do what you're ultimately tasked to do. And that's to look after and build and maintain cities. I would offer this as a sort of a preamble thought. I'm not sure you can actually solve any of this, right? This is an intractable problem, running cities. Things change by the minute. Things happen around a city, which it means you start running to try and alleviate whatever has happened. If you adopt a different kind of worldview and say you're not going to solve anything, but you're going to manage it, by definition, that means you have a different approach. So how do you manage it within an inch of its life is to try and solve it, which it never really is. It might be for a little while and then it's not solved again. So it's about how you manage it. Future cities is having optics on all of that and being able to round out my first comment to generate a place where those who live in cities enjoy living, working and playing in them.
I would like to unpack a lot of things, but first let's start with the city itself, because you now live in a farm, which is not the city, but you live there and you enjoy living there. Does the city depend on density, on crowds, on the abundance of services available? Or do you consider your living situation as an urban situation?
I think what you're asking me is, what are the things that make a good city effectively? What are the key instruments that you need to consider? So I say a lovely place to live, work and play, right? So what does that mean? If you've got hundreds of thousands or even millions of people living in a city, that's one of the things, population density, you need to consider. So how does that manifest itself in terms of when you're looking after cities or building cities or even designing cities from scratch in greenfield sites as opposed to brownfields? What are the things you need to consider? Parks and gardens, recreational spaces. What's the infrastructure costs of those sorts of things so that you get the density right with the right amount of people having access to those kind of out-of-home experiences that we all enjoy. And the reason I love going to the cities is for the restaurants and the theatre and lots of recreational facilities and playing tennis, badminton, or whatever it might be. In rural space, you've got to drive a couple of hours in many cases to even find one. So cities are about getting the balance right between those things in quite discrete areas so that people can reasonably enjoy it with respect to everyone else wanting to do the same thing. So there's always tension around space, which means you have to think carefully around things like where you put things and how far away they are and what densities have around people who are living around those facilities before you need to build a next one. So there are some notional metrics around this when people consider planning cities, a certain amount of people required to be able to afford a museum, for example, or even like a large stadium versus a small stadium versus a sports field. There's a natural sort of numbers game around affordability that you always have to balance out decisions around what you build and where you build it. Ironically, in so many ways, cities is a straight numbers game. And I don't mean that in a disingenuous way, but it is a bit of a numbers game. You've got a certain population who have got a certain amount of money we could reasonably expect to draw on, rating bases and things like that, tax bases and things like that, in order that we can build these things and maintain them. So some of the stuff that's happened historically is really interesting. And we've moved away from nation building kind of decisions, but I won't go into that now. But there's real opportunities for people to think, what are the levers around things like the economics of cities? What are the levers around what is the social outcomes that we see in cities? So economics might be affordability. Social outcomes might be good housing solutions, by way of an example, with an infrastructure lens on it. We should never forget the environmental footprint. That's super important for when we design our cities, that we consider the environment that we're living in, because we're just one part of it. And then you've got this really strong, particularly in New Zealand, really strong cultural construct that we are really coming to terms with in this country. And I know there's some countries not even as far down that track as others. So we call those the full wellbeings in New Zealand. I think it's really important that we use those levers when we think about decisions around how we manage the infrastructure.
If a city is a numbers game, do you think that there is an ideal size for a city?
I didn't mean numbers game in that sense, I don't think. What I mean by it is that you need to analyze a whole bunch of things in relation to one another to ensure that what you provide is sustainable. Just to be really simplistic about it, you wouldn't build a $10 million pipe 10 miles up the road to Mr. and Mrs. Smith's house. It's not economic, right? That's a very extreme version to demonstrate the point. But you might build that same pipe, that same distance, if there was 5,000 people in a subdivision or a suburb that you're planning for to plug all of those houses into. So that's the numbers game I'm really talking about. Because somewhere there's an economic responsibility for folk who are looking after cities to make sure they are affordable. So that's super important.
I'll be a devil's advocate for a second and ask you whether currently this kind of numbers game happens in cities. Because I've seen examples when one pair of Mr. and Mrs. Smith were wealthy enough to get that infrastructure built just for their own place, while 5,000 people were not wealthy enough to get that infrastructure being built.
That's right. That's 100% right. So I can give you a good example from times gone by and where I come from. Being in a sort of a regional rural environment, I looked after infrastructure in cities as well. So I've had the privilege of working in a number of different environments with different sized cities and towns, and in some cases even villages, if I could use that phrase, people will understand. I think what we're really talking about now is the responsibility of governors. The people are responsible for making decisions about this. So some of the affluent areas and where I come from, the analogy might be there was a group of folk within our small town who wanted what would ostensibly be called a gold tap. So they wanted running water, but they wanted a gold tap to go with it. The analogy is really around continuity of supply, the quality of the water and all that sort of stuff, which is fine, right up to the point that others in our community don't even have a tap. So investments, if you take a community view across all the people to ensure that everybody has clean running drinking water into their house, let's not worry too much about the gold tap until everyone's got a chrome one, just by way of an example. So the decision makers need to understand when they're making decisions, and councils around New Zealand, and I think globally, we're no different than many other places, Australia, states and so on, is to ensure we get the balance of our infrastructure spend right, but weighted to those things that might be considered core infrastructure. So clean drinking water was obviously one of them. Ensuring people can get to and from work with reasonable transportation networks and the like. Now, true societies also require a strong cultural presence inside their cities, like libraries, museums, art galleries and the like. That's a really integral part of the social construct and the cultural construct that is no less important than the economic one and also the environmental one that I talked about earlier. So we have to find a way to balance all of those things. And I think back to the numbers game, we have to be able to analyze it in any number of ways so that we can find the sweet spot for when we make the decision to do one thing or not. And I don't think we're as good as we could be in that space here, because I think the evidence-based decision-making, the data, what might be some people call it the data that underpins things like twin cities and digital twins and all those sorts of things. We're just learning about that. That's still pretty nascent. And actually, it's not the decision either, frankly, but it's just evidence for a decision that can be gives context that otherwise you may not see. Wellington made a big decision to save the town hall. It's a beautiful piece of Wellington's history. It's costing hundreds of millions of dollars. They've got significant infrastructure issues and pipes and roads. But you get it, right? This is a piece of the cultural construct of a city that's a better part of a couple hundred years old now. So it's not easy, right? I do think the more that we understand things like long-term liability, intergenerational equity, social outcomes, including things like health, education, and those sorts of things, the better we understand those and the better we can analyze people and our environments and our cities, the better we will be at making decisions about them.
With just this example you brought up, the townhouses in Wellington. I come from Europe and we have a lot of monuments, and I think that Europeans are doing a fairly good job keeping up those monuments. However, at some point, there is that question whether this cultural heritage worth that kind of maintenance. So if cities are numbers games and we need to find the balance between infrastructure and cultural values and the basic needs and the social construct, do you think there is, for example, a threshold when we say that maybe that cultural heritage eats up too much of our resources, which could be used, for example, social constructs or social safety nets or economic benefits or environmental benefits? Is there a threshold when we say that this balance is done?
Absolutely think there is. But every circumstance has to be weighed on the information of that particular context. And even within one city, you will ask yourself over the space of, let's say, just 20 years or whatever the number is, doesn't really matter what the time is, you'll be posited these same questions time and time again with different examples of exactly the same question. And that's the complexity we're talking about. It's when do you make a different decision from the one that you used to make? And what are the reasons you choose to do that? In affordability, economically, we just can't keep going. My silly analogy, sometimes I say, hey, we'd all live in castles if we could afford to, because it sounds like a pretty cool way to live, right? But the reality is that none of us can really afford to live in a castle, so we don't. Queen does and a couple of others. It's almost as simple as that. Where's the threshold that people who are not necessarily so wealthy can live and still live, work and play in an environment they love? Because wealth is just one of the, in some ways, the most least important thing. If you've got a really good environment, if you've got a really good social construct in your communities and the environmental footprint is sustainable, then the economic thing is much less important. It's important, don't get me wrong, but it shouldn't be the first thing you go to, because often people will find a way or they won't and will leave it, to your point.
I shouldn't have used wealthy couples before, because for me, for example, wealth is much more than money. It's that you are happy within your living circumstances. I understand what you mean. And we will get back to this kind of evidence-based decision-making that every space needs a unique solution based on their circumstances. We will get back to that. But first, I would love to know, when you think in the temporal scale, what is that scale? How long in the future are you thinking ahead?
That's a really good question, because here in New Zealand, and I guess it's in many ways no different variations on this theme, it's a very political environment these decisions are made in. That's the first point, right? And which means in New Zealand, we have local councils, regional councils, and then of course there's government, who effectively just a political environment of a different guise. In New Zealand, the government runs things like health and education centrally, which is different than other parts of the world like the UK. It's much more local. But because it's a political environment, it's subject to the machinations of political cycles. New Zealand's every 3 years and so on and so forth. The oddity, when you think about it, is so you elect a bunch of people who not necessarily so well versed in the things we're talking about. Good people, great values, all that sort of stuff. But local government is big business. Like it's big business. In fact, in many rural towns, it can be the biggest business in the town. If the political cycles are 3 or 4 years, as they are in probably most places, states is 5, obviously for some, they are there for a very, I sometimes call them part-timers, because they're making decisions on infrastructure that might last 100 years. Now, they're doing it with the best of intent and right, but we're so bound by this phrase that some of the academics might write, call it short-termism. It's just the nature of the political beast. They want to stay in power to keep making these decisions. And sometimes it's hard making big decisions, right? And they are expensive. So there's a little bit of a paradox between the governance and the framing of that with respect to the decisions they're making and the temporal element or the time that you just alluded to. So that can be really challenging, because the value in many cases is never seen by the generation that makes the decision. All they do is make the decision and they start incurring the cost, because the true value is spread over the entire life of the asset, or the whole of life cost of the asset. So let's just say a water treatment plant for a town or something like that. By and large, because we're not very good at this really long-term financial instruments that share the cost like the benefits shared over the whole life of the asset, we're still trying to figure this out if I'm going to have a crack at this. So ostensibly, you pay it off in 20 or 30 years, whatever the number is, might be a bit more. And as more people come on, then more people start paying for it. The cost is shared. But some of these assets might last 100 years. So there's a big piece of benefit that's been paid for that we struggle with. Now, some would say we use things like depreciation and we depreciate the thing over the life of the asset, which is true. But actually, in many circumstances, particularly in central governments, they don't tend to depreciate their assets at all. So they just write the check when they need another one. Councils aren't businesses. Government aren't businesses. But I might argue that there's a big chunk of it that they are. So local governments, like a local district council, of course they're not a business, but actually, boy, oh boy, 85% of their business is business, looking after infrastructure and services that if you took it into the commercial world, which sometimes there's big overlaps, it's exactly what it is. So I think there's a lot to think about in that space around how we do that. So bearing that in mind, I think most people who are responsible for infrastructure, like that kind of infrastructure, we're talking 20, 50, 100 years. We have to be, because that's how long the asset lasts. You've got to look at the end of the life of the asset. So in New Zealand, we do 10-year plans. We do 30-year infrastructure plans. This is quite recently, given we've been looking after infrastructure in towns and cities in New Zealand for a century or thereabouts, with any degree of commitment, as opposed to the organics of when we're growing the nation from scratch. But certainly over the last 100 years, and particularly post-war, and then the baby boomers, we paid big attention to infrastructure in this country. But I do think that we are starting to look at it better than we used to, along the lines of what your question is. What's really interesting is if you talk to First Nations people, so iwi Māori in New Zealand, they always talk about the mokopuna's mokopuna. So that's a grandchild's grandchild, and make decisions about that. If you go to Japan, I had the privilege of living in Japan once upon a time, really big decisions are made by a Meiji, which if I recall correctly, is like 800 years. So some of these older cultures have that kind of natural worldview that when you're making big decisions and the kind of thing we're talking about, which has influence over long periods of time, need long periods of time consideration. The challenge of this is actually sometimes those things are in conflict with what's good for the current circumstance. Some people might describe it a bit blithely as robbing Peter to pay Paul, I could put it that way. So you take from the current environment, current circumstance, to ensure that the future one is well founded. Otherwise, all you do is pass forward a liability or a circumstance that you want to think really hard about not doing. If it's your kids and your grandchildren, you're considering when you do that, right? So there's a bit of tension in that space around those sorts of things. That's probably the other part of the answer I wanted to share.
Christchurch gives a really good example on solving problems for the short term, but then learning that it wasn't really a good solution. After the first earthquake in 2010, they rebuilt everything as resilient community. And then in 2011, nature said that, nope, not again. And then they started to reevaluate how they do things instead of just going back to the original space.
It's interesting because if you take New Zealand's 3 largest cities, and I've had the privilege of working in all 3 of them, although Christchurch not so much directly, but obviously with the earthquake down there, I had some input into some activities in that space because I was pretty senior official looking after infrastructure in Wellington at the time. And many of the cities helped as much as they could, as you could imagine. What's really interesting is 2 things. The first one is the information to run a city is the information you need to run a city. It's binary, it's ones and noughts in its most simplest form. The question is, what do you and how do you use that information when you make decisions around the city? So if I was to give you a whistle-stop tour of those 3 cities and the purpose of the information that underpins the decisions, you just highlighted Christchurch. Well, the decisions was really around rebuild, but particularly of the things that weren't rebuilt, how are we going to repair and maintain the broken bit of the city that's not replaced in an affordable way? And how do we maximize utilization of those assets, notwithstanding they're broken? So there's a real lens on repairs and maintenance and maintaining infrastructure to keep the lights on, the wheels turning, as I phrased earlier, to make sure people got those services as best they could, given the pretty terrible circumstance. So that's the data that you look through like a repairs and maintenance, if you like, lens, an operating lens. You go to Wellington, our lens in Wellington was, because Wellington sits on the largest fault in New Zealand. People didn't even know there was a fault in Christchurch, but it's the main Trans-Alpine Flight Line. And literally, you can do a straight line, runs all the way up right through Wellington, then up the coast. And you actually drive along it for quite some time. Then it goes up the Hudson into the North Island. What's really interesting, all of our considerations were around resilience, vulnerability, criticality. Those considerations when you're replacing or building infrastructure. So not so much the condition of the assets, but more the resilience and the criticality of all your assets with respect to what they plugged into, e.g. a hospital. So we looked at things like flexi bends, putting earthquake-proof valves on reservoirs and things like that. So you can see same data, but a really different worldview between the two cities, right? Condition versus the sensitivity, if you like, of the assets. You go to Auckland, they don't look at either of those things. It's all about growth, capacity, utilization, future demand, population, where we're going to go, how high are we going to build it, how big's the pipe, how many more roads do we need? Same data, but now you've got three very different worldviews on how you might approach looking after the city. And all of them are valid for their circumstance. Now, I'm not saying that those things don't apply for each other, but the imperative is different. So I just wanted to share that.
We are coming back to this. Instead of solutions and solving the problems, we are managing a city part. Because you were also talking about planning a city. How is this no solutions, managing, but still planning a city comes together?
I think some of it's got to do with what you think. What does a city look like in the future? You've got to plan to something. You've got to have a point out in the ether there that this is what our future city we want to build it to. So by definition, you're going to have to throw yourself out there and design something that reflects that kind of purpose. And if you do that, then you must be in a position. If you don't, if you do it organically, it's going to end up as a hell of a mess, because actually many of the cities are a bit of a hell of a mess, because for the first 40, 50, 60, 70 years, we didn't do a lot of that. We just built stuff, and there was so much growth, no one really cared, because the next generation was coming, and it kept coming, and it kept coming, and it kept coming. But many of the cities in the world are quite static these days, and all of a sudden the next generation who was actually, they thought was coming to pay for it, haven't turned up. In fact, some of them, the cities in Japan, population is declining, for example. Now that's a problem. That's part of your numbers game again, right? The future thing is really about, so what do you want, what sort of environments do you want to create, going back to my first premise, will look like in a place where people want to live, work and play. But it's still got to be economically viable. It's still got to be environmentally sustainable. Still got to be socially constructed. And it's still got to have a strong cultural footprint to ensure that all of those things, which actually lead into a cool place to live, work and play, are given the right kind of thought process and balance. So when you do that and build to it, that's where you land. Because historically, we haven't been too good at the environmental thing. Just Wellington, for example, because I know Wellington pretty well. As recently as 1980, we used to pump all the sewerage into the harbour. We built Moa Point at around that time, which is the wastewater processing plant. There's another one over the hill, another part of Wellington. But that's not that long ago, 30, 40 years ago now. The harbour's lovely now. But in the early days, our environmental footprint was not that clever at all. But we've learned through time, you can't keep doing it like that if you want to create that place that everyone wants to play in, by way of an example. I think by putting a stake out in the future what those things look like, having enough knowledge to be able to balance that, and that's back to those evidence-based decisions again, so you get it right as you can, because you never get it 100% right, you just learn as you go, of course, then that's the way that you have to do that. The issue is that some of the stuff that you've done in the past really imposes on that thing that you're talking about in the future. And I gave you a really good example. If you want to go and swim in the beaches, of Wellington Harbour in the 1970s and 80s, you'd imposed on it so much that you couldn't. Now people swim in there regularly. It takes a long time sometimes to fix some of this stuff from decisions that were made in a not so well-informed way, but we're getting better at that.
Is it worth correcting previous decisions, or it's much more useful to create new decisions for a better future? If we want to achieve a better future for our cities, do we focus on the, yay, let's go there, or first let's increase or improve the basics and then go from there?
I think there's probably a bit of both in here. This is this tension that I alluded to before. Just to say, if money wasn't an issue, so economically you could do what you like, then you just get on it, fix it, right? And that'd be it. You go, whatever that means in many ways. But the reality is that it's a problem. When I was in Wellington, we did a lot of analysis on stormwater, for example, because we got some challenges with stormwater. We could have built a stormwater solution for the whole of Wellington to a 100-year return period flood, by way of an example, right? I think, if I recall correctly, it's a few years ago now, I thought it was about $2 or $3 billion to do that. So we would have ended up with a very dry but broke city. Somewhere in here, you've got to make some decisions where you protect as well as you can within the affordability envelope that you have. I think you have to do both. But the other reality is that cities are not going anywhere, right? So if we're careful and we're sensible and we get good information and make good decisions in time, and let's face it, our cities are improving. In time, we can get there. We just got to be a bit smart about how we do it. And a lot of the answer lies in maximizing the utilization of the assets we already have, because we often don't. And there's opportunities for us to really improve the value of the assets that we've put in the ground already, just by way of an example, without having to go and buy a whole bunch of new assets to put in new suburbs, because we've actually got capacity in the pipes in the old suburbs. But our planning rules and regulations say, well, we can't improve the density, so therefore we never actually utilize the pipes to their maximum value. So there's a lot of that stuff that goes on that sort of sits behind. So we're getting better at it, don't get me wrong. So this is why this digital twin, these twin cities, being able to analyze this numbers game again I talk about, is really important. So we can make informed investment decisions, because densities are really good measure for affordability. If you've got 1 million people in, just say, 1,000 hectares or 5,000 hectares or some number like that, as opposed to 1 million or 2 million hectares, the cost of infrastructure is not quite related to how much space you expect to make a pipe travel in terms of plugging into the communities at the end of it, but it's pretty close. So yeah, we've got to get the densities right such that we can make sure that the affordability is there. But also when you do that, you can't be too dense, because you've got no cool places to live, work and play. And again, parks and reserves and recreational facilities where those people can enjoy the environments they live in, then you're back to square one again. So you've got to balance all of that stuff, both in the current space because you've inherited, but also considering how that plugs into the future if you want to shift it in one way, shape or the other. And as many cities have found with gentrification and rebuilding inner cities and things like that, with a much more environmentally and socio-cultural footprint than they had historically. So that's something that we've learned. I'm not saying we're great at it, but we're getting better at it, that's for sure.
It's reassuring that you say that we are improving in our decision makings and the cities are improving. What is evidence-based decision making?
I had the privilege of being asked once upon a time to write the metadata standards for public infrastructure here in New Zealand. What it really was is an opportunity to take all the best and brightest knowledge around the country at the time and stick it in something. What we learned through that process was there's actually about 10 or 11 pieces of a puzzle that you need to consider when you're making an investment decision to shift a circumstance and whatever it might be, whether it's in, I don't know, sealing a road, replacing a pipe or putting a new pipe in, building a museum, whatever it is. Looking after the asset and building infrastructure, maintaining infrastructure, it was binary right up to a point where it was not binary at all. And what I mean by that is that if you understand the decision elements, so we talked about a few of these, like condition and repairs and maintenance. So if I was going to give you a little spiel around when you should replace an asset, The optimized point in time to replace an asset is when the asset replacement value, and that's its principal and interest payments and depreciation that you should collect with respect to that on an annual basis, is actually less than the maintenance on it to do the same thing, i.e. maintain the level of service. So take a pipe so people get the service. And you go, well, that makes sense, because economically it does. But actually, if you think about some other pieces of the decision about that, if it's the pipe up to the hospital versus Mr. and Mrs. Smith's place, go back to our earlier analogy, why would you ever let the pipe up to the hospital fail? So if you draw your curve, place the deterioration curve, and you put your cost to R&M, and there's a sweet spot for replacement. For the hospital pipe, you'd never allow it to hit that. So you bring it back in time and you replace it before it's really necessary, just to make sure that the asset provides a level of service, i.e. water, into a critical asset, and never not does that. If it's on the other side with Mr. and Mrs. Smith's place, you can, what we will call, sweat the asset past that point, because you've got to replace the pipe over here and you can't do both. You can't afford to do both. That's what I'm talking about. That. So there's criticality, vulnerability, resilience. There's a whole bunch of considerations. And then there's other considerations like service level, and service level might be the service that it provides. It could be the performance of the asset, its financial performance. There's a whole bunch of other things. So there's all these little metrics that you can analyze about a pipe, or any asset for that matter, which you bring to bear an analysis, and then you pop out probably a position or one or two positions as evidence for the investment decision. So that's what I'm talking about. Now, it's not the decision, and I don't mean for one second it is, because there are other considerations. But that's a whole power of capability and transparency and optics on things that you need to know to make an informed evidence-based investment decision.
That sounds fascinating. Can we measure everything you said? Criticality, resilience, everything else? Can we measure these?
Yeah, we wrote standards and have the code lists, the analytics, the algorithms, everything to do that. I'm pains to repeat, it's not the decision, but it's certainly analysis that can be done to inform the decision that those who are responsible for those decisions, councillors in a local government context, can actually see what they're deciding about. Because, hey, they're not engineers, they're not planners, they're not financial gurus or anything. They're mostly normal people who have good values, who are trying to help look after their community. So I just think it's really important that kind of information is provided so that when they make a decision, it is an informed one.
I think it's reassuring that you say that this information, these insights are just there to make the decision. It doesn't necessarily dictate the decision.
No.
As a future of cities researcher, I came across with the predict and provide approach when based on past data, we predict the future. And that sounds currently very frightening.
Or they don't predict and it just breaks.
Yes, that can also happen.
We have more capability than that. To be fair, this is, if I was going to say maybe 10 years old, maybe wouldn't be too much older than that, that people have really started to do this in a way. We've got a long way to go, don't get me wrong, but I think we're on the right track now, and some are better than others at it. Sometimes referred to the digital era, because that's not that old. We're really talking about a digital era now. We've got a new capability globally that allows us data, big data analytics, cloud solutions at high speed, all that sort of stuff. We can actually do that now. Whether people are doing it or learning how to do it, or wherever they are in that maturity curve, all that is up for question. But there's certainly a pathway there for us in the cities to help us make decisions and look after that.
You have been throwing in words like smartness, data analytics, digital twins. What does smartness mean to you? How are these connected together?
I think I'll come back to an idea that I touched on a bit earlier. These things are means, they're not ends. These are tools. How they're connected is that they will help us create the outcomes we seek with respect to what our cities look like and function within the envelope of what people want, can afford, and all of those footprints that I talked about in terms of environment and so on and so forth. So I think the connection is, how do you recognize and how is the information, how does it manifest itself in those outcomes? So I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we build water, wastewater and stormwater networks in our cities, mostly we moan about how much the pipe costs and the noise in the main street of town because we've dug it up to replace it. That's what the thing is. But do you know why we built the water pipe? There's only one outcome that we want from a water pipe in the main street of the town, really. And it's health outcomes for the town. Clean drinking water being supplied to every home or business and hospital, etc., to ensure that we have healthy lifestyles with healthy water. And wastewater is obviously the counterfactual. We'll take it away and it's treated properly so the environment doesn't take a hit, as it historically has done and still is taking in many parts of the planet. So we don't measure the outcomes of the investment we make in the pipe and the main drag at all. We haven't connected these things properly. Some of us have started to do that and can analyse for social outcomes with an infrastructure investment. But this is really new. And if you can see what the metrics are on health outcomes or something from water, then you're like in the halfway to enlightened, if I could put it that way, because you recognise the reason you're actually doing it. And the investment, although monetary, has got much more socially constructed outcomes than people that get it, but we never see it connected. Transportation's the same. Transportation, the only reason we really build transportation infrastructure is for economic outcomes. That's moving product and people to work, moving product around, getting kids to school to educate so they can be in the workforce to be productive and all that sort of stuff. But we don't measure any of that when we put a train in, not in the way that I'm talking about. So we don't directly connect our social metric with our infrastructure metrics in the way that I'm talking about. We're starting to, but we've got a long way to go. I'd probably say the only reason we build buildings, so that's good housing, clean, warm, safe, dry. I think there's the old vernacular here in the housing base in New Zealand. The more good quality houses, the more hospitals, museums, recreational facilities per capita. That's really our standard of living, ultimately. It's how well we live within our environment and in balance with it, the environment in a very broader sense now. Again, we don't really connect those things in a way that I'm talking about. As I said, we're learning to. So if you put those things together, then you've got how you should be building your city and analysing it with the outcomes that you see in health, education, justice, and social development, and all of those things, right? We're getting better, but we've got a long way to go yet, boy.
I love this highlight that these are just tools, not the mean, towards achieving what we really want. We have been talking about a few challenges and issues, but I would love to know what are your 3 biggest fears or concerns regarding the future of cities?
I think for me is we don't get it right. It's almost like the counterfactual, right? If we don't get it right, there's lots of cities around the world where you can see people aren't getting it right and they're not making any improvement, right? And I'm not going to name any, but if you've only got to wander around some cities in all parts of the globe, and let's be fair, we haven't got it all right here either, but you can see some really poster child examples of where things aren't really wrong, then that's what you get, right? So my fear is that we do not take a systems view of this, that we somehow let the agendas of small groups of people in our society, whether it could be political, could be economic, could be something in any one of those environment or whatever, although switching to balance the environment for a while probably in some cases wouldn't be bad, but might be economically for others. But the principle's still the same, right? If we don't get that balance right, then you get examples of these poster children. Now, I don't think that's going to happen in my part of the world or in yours in Australia, but we could, I don't know, we could end up somewhere in the middle of what I've been describing versus where we are now in the future. And there's a lot of people who will suffer because we didn't get it right. I have this saying I sometimes say, if you pitch at mediocrity, be careful, you might hit it. So pitch it high and strive with every inch of your being to get there. Now, sometimes it's just a timing thing. It's going to take you longer than you'd hoped, but don't take your eye off the prize, right? Keep it up there. So my fear is that there are other influences that discipline our ability to do that. And it can be just not locally or even regionally, even nationally. It can be international influences. Lord knows the globe's been through something that shook up the globe recently in terms of COVID. So there are lots of examples internationally. I think some parts of the Middle East and some parts of Europe at the moment which are in terrible state of affairs. But there are other things. for people who have the privilege of living in where we live, then our best presentation to the globe is to go and do this and show what it's like when you're not tied up in those terrible atrocities, when the political stuff or the religious stuff or whatever is somehow put to the side so people can live in harmony in these kind of cool atmospheric, or our built environment, if I could use a much more simple word, to show people that it ain't worth doing that. Just hi-ho, slow down, stop, and go and build environments where everybody can coexist comfortably. I think that's just by doing it and helping show other parts of the planet that we can do this, and people from different, I talked about the diversity in cities as being the complexity. Those people that are in those terrible circumstances all live in our cities in our part of the world. There's an opportunity for people to be able to do that. So maybe our job is to help show them.
And since you already switched from the fears to the opportunities, which I love, because it shows that you are working on these good solutions, what are the 3 biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities for you?
The first one is actually to get the base principles. And what I mean by base principles, we've got to get our data and information systems into an order that reflects the importance of the thing that we're managing. I've talked about this from time to time, and when I've spoken at conferences and things like that in the past, people immediately gravitas. If you're flying a 747 jumbo jet, the data that's flying that aircraft, because it is often flown without somebody at the wheel, as it were, the importance of that data, keep that thing in the air with all those souls on board, 400 and something, if I recall correctly, is super important, and people gravitas to it straight away. But they don't seem to gravitas to the same thing when you're running a city. But the data is actually no less important than the 747, because if the water goes down, you get something happen, or the traffic lights start doing weird things and people start banging into each other, or any number of things, information about when we invest in this or that, the data's no less important than the data in the 747. In fact, I said once at a conference, in a finance conference, that I thought the data in a city was more valued than the infrastructure itself, because the decisions that you make off the information and the financial implications of those decisions on all of the outcomes we've just been talking about, and the value of those things, if you monetize, has more value than the infrastructure itself. And of course, a couple of people come running up to me afterwards and say, what do you mean? So I explained it in terms of potentially if you can sweat assets safely, if you can recognize the value that the outcome that you're seeking in terms of community health is providing and all that sort of stuff, it's got to be close. I've never done it because we're still learning how to connect those things. But once we connect them, because we know what our health costs are in this country, by way of an example, and if you can diminish those costs, Christchurch is a poster child example of exactly when it has gone wrong, right? It's not through no fault of anybody's at all because of the natural event that happened out there. But people started to see the true value of infrastructure, because when they didn't have it, it's a problem in Houston for the very first time. And I guess what taught New Zealand, and I suspect it teaches many places when you get these natural disasters, New Zealand's engineers, et al., others, have done a pretty good job for the last 100 years because no one cares about it, because everybody just assumes the delivery and the service, right? And all of a sudden, when something like that happens, all of a sudden they don't. And people are trying to run around with a bucket to try and find some clean water that used to be coming out of their, to go back to my analogy, my chrome tap. So people immediately start to get the sense of the value. And I've stood in council, presented investments to councillors, to decision makers many times over the years. On the odd occasion, you get a discussion that says, so expensive. And I've said, councillor, if you wander down to the stream with your bucket to do the same thing, I'm sure you'll have a different view if everywhere in the town's running down to the stream or the river, which, by the way, may not be as drinkable as you think as it could be. The true value is not so much in the pipe. True value is in the health outcomes and the well-being it generates in the communities when you invest in those kind of things.
I really appreciate you talking about these second and third order consequences. So when we establish a water pipe, it's not about getting the pipe in the ground, but getting water and increasing the health of the inhabitants. That's very important. And I'm always amazed when interviewees talk about this, because in the general thinking, I don't really get the feeling that we are good at this kind of not just first, but second and third order consequences.
Somehow we need to learn to put those sort of layers of benefit, the outcomes as we've described them, and share them across the community and all the community groups, not just one portion of the community. So there's a big question around distributive being, is what I'm talking about. To take a really perverse example where it doesn't work, take the production of food on the planet, right? There's 700 million people who are starving, but yet we produce enough food for the planet once, twice, 3 times over. What are we doing? So if you know that those kind of circumstances exist in another space, how do we ensure in our cities that the wealth and well-being of our populations and communities living within them have equal access, inverted commas, to the things that we work hard to provide, such that people do get to live and enjoy and play and work in the way that we've alluded to. So I just wanted to talk about, or just to share that sort of thought. This is not a socialist comment, because that sounds socialist, like it's egalitarian, equalitarian, all that sort of stuff. It's not about that. It's just making sure that we look after ourselves as people with the same opportunities in those environments when we do. And I think we're still trying to figure out how to do that, because wealth is not linear. And the question is, how do you deconstruct that? Tax is one way of distributing wealth, and rates, you might argue, it's something similar. Rates pays for the infrastructure, but not everybody gets access to all of the things all the time, because there are different avenues to get access. Rates is one, helps pay for certain things, but then there's things like fees and charges. Get into a swimming pool, you got to pay. To get into a library, you got to pay for a library. But some places you do, some places you don't. So it's quite complex. And how you charge water, volumetrically or not, do you measure it or not with water meters? There's no end of instruments here. So I suspect there is no one answer to this yet. I think there probably, one breath I want to say there is one answer to this. And I could probably just as easily and counterfactually argue there isn't. So, but I'd like to think some stage there is a point where we just know how to do it for everybody's single circumstance. And it's okay with everybody else's circumstance with respect to that, because we've all got the right to clean drinking water, to access to parks and gardens, to go out and swim in a swimming pool because that's what you enjoy, as opposed to go to the library or even do both. We've got a long way to go to figure out this.
Yeah, we do have a long way to go. I'm wondering about your answer to, yes, we could do it, but no, we can't do it, because are you talking about providing the same opportunities or the same outcomes for every city?
I think that's the dilemma, is where, because those two things are not the same. Opportunity and outcome are very different. I suspect one is precursory to the other. So if you don't have an opportunity, then you don't get the outcome. So you need to provide the opportunity. So what does that look like? And if you provide the opportunity, are you actually achieving the outcome you sought with it? So one's a derivative, I think, of the other. The reason I hesitate is saying, that, is it possible for there to be one suite of opportunities that deliver a suite of outcomes for a city that meets all of the needs of an individual within a city? It's a big ask, right? It's a really big ask. I think it's possible that within a cohort of people's common interest, that's what we do every day, right? That's the thing we try and meet. If you take the normal curve, the outlier is always going to be really tough, right? But if you can mainstream it, if you could come in one standard deviation or some weird number like that and meet all of that, then that's fantastic. If you come in another one, then that's not so good, but it's still okay. Then that's not so good, because actually there's quite a big part of the population that you're not meeting their needs. So somewhere in that curve, using that silly analogy, is the sweet spot for things like environmental sustainability. Economically, is it affordable, financially sustainable? Does it have the right socio-cultural layer to meet the needs of those who live in the cities? I do think part of it is about opportunity and part of it is about outcome. I do worry that some of the legislative instruments are not necessarily well connected to the regular ones, as they could be. And by definition, that means that some of these opportunities are quite difficult to grasp, because they're run by other folk, like central government runs health. Central government looks after at least half the roads in our towns, but all our state highways. So other people are making the decisions that influence our communities. They say they will participate in consultation, and we've got a long way to go in that space too. Citizenship deficits is the phrase. If you're talking to people about a road, who knows about a road? Communities know about roads, they just know about the outcomes they provide. There's lots of work to do between the interface of building things and doing things with cities and the communities who they're building them for and creating the environments for to ensure they get it right when they do build them.
I also asked this question, we are talking about equal opportunities or equal outcomes, because I feel that if we want to provide equal outcomes, then we can't honor the uniqueness of the city, because each city would need to provide the same outcomes instead of the same opportunities, where the opportunities provide the chance for the inhabitants to do whatever they want to do with those opportunities.
It makes me smile because I've had this conversation over the years from time to time. The outcomes are the same, but the built environment may be different to achieve them. Vienna has a very different set of infrastructure requirements for the outcome for that city, given its natural circumstances and its age and its cultural significance, not just locally, but globally, versus, say, Auckland City or Sydney. But the outcomes for their people are no different. They want to be able to do the things they enjoy doing in that environment, but the infrastructure to support it is not going to be the same. Fair?
That's fair. And the distributed well-being, it's a very interesting approach towards how we could understand this kind of sharing opportunities, sharing outcomes. That's really interesting. I would love to go back to some snippets you said, because first you said that we can't know what the future holds and that everything changes in cities and we can measure those changes. But then you also said that cities are becoming more static than they were before. I feel some discrepancy here. Could you please explain a bit more why there isn't a discrepancy?
I'm not sure I would have put it like that, but what I did say was that cities' built environment is preset because you have a city. So that's the static piece, if I could use. That's what its current circumstances. So when you come along and you're expected to try and figure out how the last 100 years fits into the next 100 years, then you've got a last 100 years you need to consider when you do. That's what I really mean, right? So you've got a current footprint and you need to figure out what things you can influence, still maximizing the benefit of the investment that's already in the ground and built. But how do you transform that into a different footprint or environment, the one that you want in the next 100 years to build to? How do you do that sort of through time without stopping the city, might be one way to put it. And many of our cities are just full of orange cones at the moment because we are literally at the first full replacement cycle of our assets since the Second World War. If you think about it, it's the better part of 80 years ago. Most pipes are about that old, just by way of an example. And the population densities have increased. So there's lots of things what people are thinking about in terms of where they put the pipes, how big are they going to put them, what's the density going to be, where they're pointing to, and all those sorts of things. My point really is around that it is a very dynamic environment. Some of it's precast, excuse the pun, with concrete, but there are lots of opportunities to improve what the look and feel of the cities are, to point to that being piece. When we do make these decisions, I also want to add that there is definitely steps in the maturity of a city where we have to do certain things. I alluded to it, from playgrounds to a stadium at a local football club to a medium-sized stadium, something akin to FGC one in Hamilton where we play, the Chiefs play rugby or a small thing like that, versus an Eden Park or a Stadium Australia, which is international. These are the kind of stages that I'm alluding to. That's just a manifestation of what I'm saying. And it's based on population. So there's a whole bunch of rules that you put in place of the things you might consider in a small local town, which is no less important to that small local town. But they're not necessarily the same considerations to a regional city, like a small city in New Zealand's terms or Australia's terms, to a large city, to a global city, a really big city. And as time goes, cities are moving through these. See, Auckland is a really good example of this over the last 30, 40 years. It's not that long ago, the city was just a few 100,000 people in the context of somewhere between probably 1.6 and 1.8 million people. It's nearly going to be 2 million people. So that's actually a step up from where I was talking about. And it takes time to do that, but the considerations are very different because that's one of these nation building phases I was talking about. You get away with short-termism down here, looking out 10, 15 years, blah, blah, blah. You need to be thinking 100 years up here. So there's some fundamental shifts so that we need to consider when we're thinking about this.
I really appreciate your putting in context the different levels, different maturity levels of the cities. You previously also talked about resilience. Resilience is a very interesting term because it can mean various things to various people. What does resilience mean to you?
Resilience is actually part of a suite of things that you need to consider in a slightly broader sense. So there's actually four. There's vulnerability and criticality, there's risk, and then there's resilience. And there is actually a relationship between those four things. When you talk about infrastructure, what you're talking about is really a resilience to an event. So we talk about earthquakes, a flood, or some other natural events, right? So let's just use those as an example. To understand resilience, you need to understand two things before the event. How critical is the asset and how vulnerable is the asset? So take a hospital, super critical asset, right? Piece of infrastructure. How vulnerable is it? What's the pipe up to it that supplies the water? Going back to the analogy we've been using. The hospital might be earthquake proof or not. Maybe it's sitting on a liquefaction zone. Maybe the pipes go through a liquefaction zone. So you've got some pre-event circumstances, i.e. some vulnerability circumstances or some criticality circumstances, vis-a-vis it's a hospital, that you need to consider even before you talk about resilience. So you need to understand these two things before you can talk about this. There's a piece in the middle called risk. And what risk is, what is the likelihood and consequence, to use those two phrases, of a particular event at a particular scale stopping the hospital from performing its service that it's designed for. So if it's a one earthquake, no problem. If it's two, problem, so on and so forth. If it's 7, problem 8, big problem 9, gone. So you need to understand the risk and what the resilience is. Actually, if it breaks post-event, how long does it take for it to return to the point that it was delivering the services at the level of services pre-event? So that's what resilience is in infrastructure. How resilient is the infrastructure to any given circumstance or event that stops it or disciplines its ability to deliver its pre-event services post-event? But in order to understand resilience, you need to understand the event, i.e. what's the risk and likelihood of that, because that's part of the question around resilience. And even before you asked about risk, you need to know the vulnerabilities and the criticalities of the thing you're talking about in the first instance. So that's the paradigm that we put together in the data standards to collect information around all of those things so we could give some sense of an understanding of our city landscape on what infrastructure was critical, what are our critical assets, what were their vulnerabilities with respect to their physical environment that included operating environments, and what was the risk of any event of a particular magnitude breaking the asset and stopping it delivering the service at the level of service that it was designed to do. And importantly, so your resilience question, how long did it take to get back to the point where it was delivering those services as it did pre-event?
It puts resilience in perspective, but I will challenge this and ask you whether is resilience enough? Is going back to the pre-event levels is enough?
I think the way I'd probably ask the question, because I've just described an infrastructure lens on that. I didn't talk about service and the people and the community outcomes, just by way of an example, right? So if our water pipes break, the people don't get drinking water, the reservoirs crack and the water rushes out all into the harbour or something. So resilience can come in the form of a bottle of water to the community and bottled water for as long as it takes. My point is that that layer I described is really important around making decisions around investment to increase the resilience of the city through time. For example, don't put your pipes in liquefaction zones. And you go, well, actually you have to. Okay, don't use concrete. Use other materials with flexi joints, by way of an example. You absolutely have to do this before the event, understand all this before the event, because if you don't know where your concrete pipes are in your liquefaction zones, you won't know that's where they're going to break. And you will not know that if you've got 2 hospitals plugged into them, they're not going to be hospitals for very long unless you find a water solution when an event like that happens. I stand by my position because one of the things is a strategic asset manager who's looking after this bit of a strategic worldview. I've just described what an asset manager in an operational sense might do if something actually happened. But actually the second person will be in a much better position to deal with that circumstance by managing it on a day-to-day basis if they have the strategic asset management information in front of them. So they know when things go pear-shaped for whatever reason, they know where to go and check out first to make sure that the services are being provided because they're at the most risk because they are vulnerable and they've got critical assets, and that you have got a resilience solution to that, which may be bottled water, to ensure that the city runs in those events.
Have you heard of the approach and term anti-fragility, anti-fragile systems? I'm asking this because for me, it seems that resilience is critical, but resilience also limits our approach. Because if we surpass resilience, which resilience is to bouncing back to the levels before the event, and we think more about not resilience but anti-fragility, we can create systems which not just survive the shocks, but also thrive on those shocks, learn from those shocks.
I think anti-fragility is resilient, actually. I think it's a syntax or lexicon difference. I actually think that they are both the same thing, because if you take resilience to its natural conclusion, which includes the social constructs of cities in emergency circumstances, all of the things that are in anti-fragility space are actually in what resilient cities do with their communities on top of the infrastructure, not the infrastructure itself. Because what you're really talking about is how well does the city respond and look after itself in these events. I haven't read a lot about anti-fragility in terms of the academic literature. I've certainly read a lot on the others, as you might recall, because anti-fragility is a relatively recent term, to be fair, I would have thought. But I just see it's just resilience dressed up with a slightly different worldview. But if I'm going to have a crack at it, probably has more of a community worldview on it as opposed to an infrastructure worldview on it. But they're not mutually exclusive. And I think the purpose is the same. Because actually, some people need to focus on the infrastructure when these things happen, because it is about bricks and mortar. That's what it's about. But no less importantly, in those circumstances, some people also need to focus on the communities. So I think if I was going to have a crack at what I think, as I said, I'm no expert in this anti-fragility stuff. I've just read a bit about it more recently. But what I sensed out of what I read and what I know as being a bit of a hard-nosed infrastructure guy for a second, is that if you put the two worldviews together, then you get what actually asset managers and people who look after infrastructure with a high-end social construct in the decision-making when they make them, you can end up in the space you're talking about in what I'd call wartime as opposed to peacetime. Because decisions made in those circumstances have to be fast, hard, and they're really important. But actually the information required to make those things is all the same. I've always viewed it like this as a bit of an odd analogy. If the knowledge required to run a city under peacetime circumstances is like a sine wave that looks like this, right? If you have a natural disaster, decisions are like this. The sine curve washes up, so it's much more intense. Decisions have to be made faster and all those sorts of things. But actually, if you look at the top and the bottom of the sine waves in both circumstances, they're the same height. You need the same information, you just need it faster, and you need to make more, you need more of it and all that sort of stuff. When I say the information in those two circumstances is the same, it's just that the operating environment means you have to do it in a different way. Super conceptual.
But it makes sense. And just to clarify, you say that anti-fragility is the peacetime thinking and resilience is the wartime thinking?
Oh, no, I think it's possibly the other way around. Because you can think about things like vulnerability, criticality, and where things are and what you do, and how do you improve the resilience of your city. I gave a couple of examples by putting earthquake-proof valves on all of our reservoirs around Wellington City over a period of time. Now, if something breaks, then all the water's not going to drain out of the reservoirs. That's building resilience into the city. When we're replacing concrete pipes and liquefaction zones, we're going into HDPs and things like that with flexi joints because we know it's going to move around. Concrete doesn't move, it just breaks. So that's improving the resilience of the city over time. So that's what I mean by you can become aware of the vulnerabilities and the criticality. So we focus on the pipes into the hospital first when the time's right. Then we reassess the risk, and now we increase the resilience of the city by doing that across the city over time.
Before we hit record, we had a few conversations and we agreed on it's very critical to understand in a city space the why, the how, and the what. Could you explain the relationships between these three?
Those are the meat and sandwich of why we do what we do, I think. If you don't have purpose, that's a problem. The first thing we really need to understand is why we're doing things, right? If you've got good purpose and an understanding of your environment, which comes next, then that's the first cab off the rank for me. I go back to the Auckland or the Wellington or the Christchurch infrastructure purpose in those cities. They're quite different, right? So the first thing you do is understand purpose. The next thing that you need to understand is what are you going to do? The first thing you need to do is actually collect enough information so you can do that. So the first part of the what is having enough information in front of you so you can actually do what you want to do in terms of looking after a city. So that's another kind of what. First what's data collection, the next what's data analysis, the next what is decision making, the next what is putting a pipe in the ground because all the stuff, the analysis you've done says you need a pipe in the ground in its broad sense, right? But the really interesting thing is what comes next. It's how do you do that? And many years ago, I stumbled across this phrase, the wow is always in the how. And it is so true because actually why you do stuff can be pretty straightforward. What you need to do to meet the outcome that you want is often pretty straightforward as well. It's calculable and that sort of stuff. How you do it's a whole different ballgame. And I think if you don't understand the system that I talked about earlier, because I haven't really mentioned this much, but all this conversation is underpinned by a systems view of everything. And I gave a nice little example around resilience just a moment ago. It's actually not just one thing. It actually sits in a system as of thinking when you do that. This is no different. So ultimately, the how ties back to the purpose again. So that there's a system of events and considerations, but it's all about the purpose and the outcome that you seek. And part of the outcome is in how you do that, because if you don't do it the right way, there's a lovely phrase in Māori, it has to be tika and it has to be done with tikanga, which means it has to be right and done in the right way. Because if it's right and it's not done the right way, then it's not right. We immediately start thinking about, in the systems view of things, consultation with the community, consultation with affected parties in terms of putting a road through their farm. Just there's lots of examples of where if you did it, people are much less aggrieved if they understand the purpose, and there are instruments to ensure that the effect of all of that is minimised on the community, notwithstanding the wider community benefit doing something of that nature holds. An example was I was part of a natural disaster which basically wiped out half the town through a big flood. It's actually a debris flow and houses were floated down the river and literally things like that. And one of the things that I was asked to do in my role in the council as an exec and looking after that stuff, I had to go and buy the properties off the townsfolk because we were never going to let them build there again. So that was pretty tough, right? But actually, when you put the right purpose to protect people in the future, when you approach them about what we were doing and why we were doing it, how you did it was super important when you spoke to those folks. That's the point. So many of them really struggled with leaving for all the obvious reasons, and that's normal, natural, and you'd expect that. But as time went on and the decisions were made, and if you talk to them, I bump into them in the street even at home now from time to time. That was a really tough time. In many ways, they'll still suffer the loss. But they see now, because they really back in the middle of the fire in those days, they see now that actually it probably wasn't the worst thing that they did, because some who live not too far away, which is not in the path, they still wake up when it's very heavy rainstorms, even all these years later. There's a bit of real world experience that goes into some of the thinking that I'm sharing with you. And it's important that you get to reflect on those things when you make different decisions at a different time for sometimes similar reasons, or maybe not quite as extreme reasons as those ones. But ultimately, it's about creating cool places for people to live. And there are costs associated with that for some, this notion of greater good when you have to make those kind of decisions. And oh, by the way, I'm not a counsellor, so I don't profess to make the decisions, but I'm spent a large chunk of my life providing advice to counsellors and in fact ministers and things of the like to help them make the decisions that they want to with some evidence. So when they do, that they've got some rationale for that. It's nice to think that mostly people are nascent beings.
Yeah, it's a good thing. And it's interesting to hear that the end doesn't justify the means. It's very important how we do things.
The counterfactual also applies. The means doesn't justify the ends, and the ends don't justify the mean. You have to get those two things in balance.
Haydn, you have been very generous with your time, and I appreciate your answers and your honesty with these questions. What is your role in establishing the future of cities?
If I had a view on what my role is, I'm towards the end of my career. I've been doing infrastructure in cities for the better part of 20 or 30 years now. And part of my career was strongly commercial and heavy infrastructure, in fact, in steel mills and fabrication, things like that. The largest ones in the Southern Hemispheres. Came with a certain kind of worldview into infrastructure in cities. So there's always a strong economic lens on it for a long time. It was summarily beaten into place with the social constructs I've now talked at length about for a whole host of reasons. I guess what I think my role is now is to share what I know. My background is a little unusual in as much as my training of my first studies were in sciences and earth sciences and those sorts of things. So I naturally gravitas towards engineering and applied sciences, which I've done a little bit of as well. But in much more recent years, mid-years, I did a lot of work in the data space and the big data analytics, intergenerational equity, long-term liability, socio-constructed wellbeing analytics, and all of those sorts of things. I could talk about those for a long time. And I touched on it when I said we just didn't build infrastructure in this country or any country or anywhere for the sake of the pipe. We did it for outcomes and communities. So that data piece is actually really important. And the last piece is I now work for a First Nations tribe in an international vernacular. I work for iwi in New Zealand, literally building infrastructure solutions for them for the next 100 years plus. And it's strongly linked to things like aquaculture and agriculture and things like that. Building really large facilities for processing and those sorts of things. My role for cities now is to share the knowledge I have. If folk are interested in a slightly different and experiential view on a whole bunch of circumstances that I've had the privilege of participating in over the years. Yeah, so my role is to just advocate, advise, and when necessary, defend. In some cases, spend a lot of time defending the position of the tribes that I work for here in New Zealand, because everyone's entitled to this stuff and not all have access to it. I think that's what my responsibility is now, is to share what I know. So you get to a certain part of your life towards the end of it when you want to pass on what you know to the next gen, albeit that's challenging with the most current generations, I might add. But I think that's a little piece of the legacy of all the learnings that I have in my PhDs and how governments and councils make large capital investment decisions on behalf of their communities. So I've done a lot of research in that space over the years that sort of sits underneath the hood of my position or my understanding or my teachings, my learnings that I would pass on. It's got some structure, might be the way I'd put it.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge, because it's always invigorating and enlightening to listen to your experience. Fortunately, this wasn't the first time I had the pleasure, and I hope it won't be the last.
I could ask you for hours about sustainability and nation states and city states and everything else. But do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
By the way, city-states are just an amalgam of nation-states, as we know. The question is, how do you glue them together so they act like a nation as opposed to a bunch of cities? Just saying. Maybe if I rephrase the question, what would my aspirations for their walkaway be? I think I would say, if it was me listening to this, I would hope that people took away that they gave some thought, particularly infrastructure people, some more thought, some deep thought into why they do what they do and what the real purpose is in when you're building cities. Well, they will say that they do this, right? Because I don't know any people who don't do that, actually look after cities, right? To be fair. But what I'm saying is there is a whole lot more that can be done to capture the understanding between the outcomes of building infrastructure in cities and maintaining infrastructure for cities that we don't capture. And voting in local government elections and participating in local government activities is a testament to what I'm saying is correct. So somewhere between 40 and, if you're lucky, mid-40s of the population vote who are eligible to vote in local government in New Zealand. An old mayor, I seem to draw the normative curve in people's minds a couple of times during this conversation, but a mayor once stood up at the beginning of a 10-year plan, community engagement, which is every 3 years. It said the only people that will walk in the front door will be the people who are at either end of the normative curve, at one end or the other, and all the people who like what we do, who don't walk in through the front door, i.e. the majority of the people in communities think we do a pretty good job and we just get on with it. But we don't really hear for those people by and large. And his point was that we don't really have instruments. We think we do, but we don't have instruments that capture the voice of the people who think we do a great job. There's a wonderful example of what the council did in London a few years ago, because people don't really know what local government does, actually. They do, but they don't in so many ways. What London Council did is they went and got all the employees, put red dots on everything around the city to show Londoners what London Council did in terms of looking after their infrastructure and their services. London was covered in bloody dots. It really took, as I understood it, was reported, it really took the city by a little bit of surprise. They didn't realise they did this, that, and the other, all those things. Local government does literally roads, we do waste, water, wastewater, stormwater. Some of us do residential, or the pension housing, herb housing. Some of us do libraries, museums, art galleries, dog control, planning. But there's a plethora of things. That's what I've learned over the many years of doing this. Maybe I can just add a little bit of knowledge to that, but also get people to think more about the stuff that they don't do and they're not quite so connected to, notwithstanding some attempts for them to do that.
Thank you so much, Haydn.
It was really interesting to hear from Haydn about how we can use the why, how, and what trifecta for establishing better urban futures. Not to mention his description of intergenerational equity. Amelia Gaskell talked about what this can mean in episode 177. You can find out more about Haydn online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Haydn's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcripts and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?